Hello. Hello. And welcome to the Bison, the WCS Storytelling Project. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Stephen Sautner from the WCS Communications Department. Today you will hear your colleagues tell their wildlife stories before a live audience. That's us. The Bison is a pilot project and is part of a larger internal communications initiative that will include things like speed talks coming this fall. We are hoping to turn the Bison into a regular series as part of WCS 2020 to inspire and to tell stories to new audiences about cool science. And let's not be modest. We are sitting on a gold mine of stories about cool science, conservation, and wildlife. If you're like me, countless stories come to mind. Here's a quick one that remains largely untold. Several years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I saw Pat Thomas, our general curator, walking at the Bronx Zoo. He shuffled a little stiffly, almost like he had overdone it at the gym the day before. So I asked him, "Pat, you okay? You look a little sore." Now, if this was any other workplace, say an insurance company, his reply would have been, "Yes, I overdid it at the gym, or I slipped on the ice, or on a bar of soap, or something mundane like that." But this is WCS, which, let's say, is a little different. Pat's reply, "Oh, that! I got beat up by a rhino." Only at WCS would you ever hear such a response. And then he limped off before I could hear the story, and I'm still waiting for that one. Before we get started today, I especially want to thank today's storytellers for being the first to volunteer. John Slatt, and from Mozambique, Tim McClanahan. I think they deserve a round of applause. I'd like to thank my colleagues who helped plan this first event: Natalie Cash, Steve Fairchild, Nat Moss, Maddie Thompson, Jeff Morey, and our friends at IT. Now, I ask you to please imagine we are all at a campfire. We've all had a drink. Maybe two. Maybe three for some. Maybe some s'mores. Laughter and goodwill are flowing. The campfire is crackling. A nice smell of wood smoke is in the air. An owl is hooting. Okay, ready for some stories? Yeah. Our first story is by Tim McClanahan, senior conservation zoologist out of Mombasa, Kenya. Tim will take us to a wild place, Somalia, as he attempts to count fish on a coral reef with a unique set of challenges. Here's Tim.
Thanks, Stephen, and hi. My name is Tim McClanahan, and I work as a coral reef scientist for the Wildlife Conservation Society. I've been working for over 25 years in tropical countries to better understand and manage coral reefs. One of the main things that I do is count fish and analyze the data to find important patterns that tell us something about reef health and how to better manage coral reefs. I often hear from non-scientists that this seems impossible. Like most difficult jobs, it is possible when you break it up into the component parts and focus on one task at a time. So this is a story about the challenges and opportunities of working in poor tropical countries, and possibly the limits to counting coral reef fish, and possibly coral reef science in general. I pride myself for collecting data and doing quantitative evaluations of coral reefs. I rarely accept to do consultancies. Nevertheless, an opportunity to study some rarely visited reefs in northern Somalia opened up after a civil war ended in the mid-1990s. I consulted the literature and found some outdated and dusty taxonomic books described by French scientists in the 19th century. Consequently, I thought this would be a rare opportunity to visit reefs never visited by scientists, and I hope to collect some data in this unique and unstudied environment. As a focused scientist, nothing had got in my way before, so I agreed to the consultancy and boarded a 4-seated plane to Djibouti, Somalia. On landing, I was greeted by a one-legged Italian working for a poverty alleviation organization. We greeted, and I looked down at where his leg once was. He looked back at me and said, "I would not go spearfishing if I were you. I lost my leg to 2 Zambezi sharks while spearfishing, and I would not be alive today except for a doctor who found me washed up on the beach." Good advice, I thought. With that, he took me to the port where I was introduced to a grumpy Belgian boat captain who regularly took out French Navy personnel for pleasure dives on the Djibouti reefs. He had never been to Somalia, appeared unwilling to go there, and spent most of the evening trip to the border complaining about poor pay and incompetency, all over hard drinks, frustration, and curses. The following morning after dawn, I was pulling on my wetsuit when I noticed a small, overloaded skiff heading from the dry Somali coast towards our anchored boat. As the overloaded boat came into sight, I saw what looked like 8 men, 7 in tattered khakis carrying Kalashnikovs, and 1 older man in a second-hand suit. The overhung misanthropic captain started at their sight and grew increasingly anxious as they began to board the boat without any formalities. The older man in the suit emerged from behind the guards and introduced himself as the mayor of Zayla and demanded $200 for visas to enter northern Somalia, a country that I didn't know existed. All seaman protocol and national laws had been breached according to the captain, and a verbal brawl ensued that became increasingly impolite and loud. I sensed a long and abrasive conversation and returned to pulling on my remaining diving gear and slipped off the boat and into the reef below. Immediately, the human din was replaced by a riot of bright colors and pulsating fish flesh, as if millions of eyes were looking at me at once. Me, the odd intruder at the colorful and riotous Mardi Gras. I knew immediately this was going to be a challenge. Counting fish where there seemed to be no distance between them, where Latin names of species reeled in my brain, and my head could not write fast enough to record it. I gathered myself, reminded myself of this opportunity, an opportunity to describe a never-before-studied reef, as I lay my transect line and began counting. Shortly into this increasingly frustrating job, I felt an eerie feeling of being watched. Not just the many eyes around me, but something much larger and more present. I turned and looked over my shoulder, and there they were, 2 of the largest fish I have ever seen, a male and female humphead wrasse, just a few feet away from me, peering at me and my slate, as if to check if I was recording the details of their domain correctly. For those of you who do not know reef fish, a humphead wrasse is a massive, band-sized blue-green species with thick, fleshy lips, and the male has a bulbous hump on its forehead. It is the largest wrasse species, and some males grow to nearly 8 feet and weigh over 400 pounds. They change from females to males at about 3 to 4 feet. And here I believe I was seeing the terminal stages of what may have been the largest observed male and female pair, both examining me inquisitively for a clue to my purpose. It quickly became impossible for me to concentrate, and my fish number estimates were becoming unrealistic. So I decided to roll up the transect line and set it again further down the reef, out of the way of these 2 giants. Once again, shortly after setting the second transect, the same feeling. Again, my privacy felt invaded, and sure enough, as I turned, a completely new pair of wrasses, only slightly smaller, but equally curious, were examining me. My work in numbers became increasingly impossible to justify, and so I decided to return to the boat and think my strategy. Once the captain and the mayor had sorted out their issues, I hoped. Climbing the stairs, I realized nothing had been settled, and was greeted by the loud, belligerent insults of the captain and stubborn rebuttals of the mayor. Immediately I realized this problem would not be solved by more talking. So I quickly headed to my cabin, where I grabbed my passport, $200, and presented it to the mayor. He deflated, and the captain glowered at me furiously. "Get your passport," I barked at him. He backed off and came with his passport, and the problem was resolved. The mayor looked at me admiringly. Fine. I'd like to visit. The next day, on a skiff and 4 armed guards arrived. at the dive boat and took me the 10 kilometers to shore in the small town of Zela. Zela, a small ghost town with a few houses and no windows and doors. And the mayor and I sat in the only chairs, he behind the only desk, and we made small talk through a translator. I want you to use my guards for your research, he told me, as we headed back to the boat. Thanks, I said, not sure if this was a good outcome or not. So every morning at daybreak, a small skiff and 4 men carrying Kalashnikovs greeted me. They took me to the reef to collect my data, beneath the watch of the glowering captain. I dove into the swarm of fish flesh below, and despite my efforts to improve my methods, I fell short of my expectations to collect repeatable scientific data. I was, however, inspired by the reef and resolved to produce a consultancy report that in some ways reflected this inspiration. It was a journey beyond normal science. Possibly I had finally met my match, and the limits to breaking up tasks, and possibly the limits to counting fish.
Thank you, Tim. Our next and last story is by John Slatt of WCS's Asia program. John is an ornithologist by training, but found himself in the middle of a mega mammal death match. John.
Hey, thanks. So this is a story that starts with a tiger. It involves a bear or two. But if I had to choose, I'd say this is a story about a crow. Oh, I'm a wildlife biologist, and I work in the Russian Far East. It's a region so far east that borders North Korea, and the town I'm based in is only about 200 miles from Japan. It's a region with steep coastal cliffs and rolling mountains controlled by tigers, leopards, bears, and lynx. The rivers are choked with salmon, and there are very few people. Now, I'm a bird guy at heart, and most of my 20 years in the region has been focused on birds. First, songbirds, and then more recently, black-skin fish owls. And these are enormous salmon-eating birds that live in some of the most remote corners of Northeast Asia. And that's what I was doing in the village of Ternay when the story takes place in June 2006. I was just finishing up a field season searching for black-skin fish owls. Ternay is also home to WCS's Siberian Tiger Project. And I didn't work for WCS then, but I've been friendly with those guys for a number of years. And over evening beers, I'd hear stories about tigers roaring in the bushes or blocked charges by bears. And I want to be clear that these stories weren't told with bravado, but rather with matter-of-factness. In a, this is what I did at my job today sort of way. So I'd listen to these guys and secretly be happy that these things weren't happening to me. And I think a lot of the non-large carnivore researchers in the room can sympathize that there's something kind of intimidating about massive, toothy predators that like to hide from things and then later jump out and kill those things. So when John Goodrich, who was then the field coordinator for the Siberian Tiger Project, asked me to help him find a dead tiger, that seemed like a relatively benign activity and one that would not involve a lot of running away. See, John had received reports that a radio-collared male tiger hadn't moved in days. And this likely meant one of two things, and both of them were bad. Either the tiger was just laying in the forest dead, or it had been shot and its collar removed by poachers to cover their tracks. So John picked me up in his truck, and we drove about 10 miles west of Ternay, so we were fairly close to town. And when we stopped, he took out his VHF receiver, and this is what we were going to use to hone in on this dead animal. He turned it on, and we were both surprised to hear the steady beats of an active radio signal. So radio signals are either active, meaning the tiger is up and moving about, or they're passive, meaning that the tiger, or more precisely the caller, hasn't moved in a number of hours. And it was a series of these passive signals over several days that had prompted field assistants to deem this tiger dead. Clearly they'd been mistaken, and I assumed that our afternoon search was over. A live tiger is a very different beast than a dead one. But John wanted to push on just to be sure. I mean, it was possible that the tiger was dead and that a fox or some other carnivore had been tugging at the carcass and jostled the collar into activity. So we follow the strength of the signal across a valley and start up a hill, with John stopping periodically to reassess our trajectory. About halfway up this hill, the signal weakens and then vanishes. We move ahead slowly, and right before we got to the ridge, we find a tiger bed. Now, a tiger bed is just an impression on the forest floor and the leaves where the tiger had just been. It heard us approaching, it stood up, moved over the hill crest and into the neighboring valley in retreat. So my eyes are fixed on this ridge, just waiting for a tiger to come exploding across it, because I've heard stories that start like this. But John's engrossed in this tiger bed. He's picking up stray hairs and holding them to the light. He kneels down closely and inhales. When he stands up, he has this puzzled look on his face, and he says, "Yeah, I smell tiger, but I also smell bear. I think this tiger's been eating a bear. Let's go look for a dead bear." So understand that this part of Northeast Asia is the only place in the world where tigers and brown bears share the same forests. You essentially have two kings in one castle. They do interact, and they do sometimes kill each other. In fact, there was once a radio-collared male tiger whose prey preference, and I want to repeat that, whose prey preference was female brown bears. So the prospect that John and I had stumbled upon a direct and fatal encounter between these two mega carnivores filled me with simultaneous feelings of dread and wonder. We began the systematic search for a kill, moving in a circle emanating from that tiger bed. And every once in a while, we'd walk into a patch of forest that was just heavy with the aroma of death. Sense of decay can sometimes drift from a point of origin and hang in the air far from the carcass itself. And so, especially in a forest with a dense understory, it can be surprisingly difficult to find a giant dead thing, even though you know it's there. So we searched for the better part of an hour before giving up. We saw a log and sat on it, and we're figuring out how we're going to get back to the truck from there, when I heard the sound of wings. I look up and I see a crow flying towards us. When it gets to us, this crow looks down, caws, wheels in the sky, and then flies back in the direction from which it had come. We watch it continue talking, and then a minute later, that same bird, or one just like it, comes back and does the same thing. John's interest in the search is renewed. He recalls stories of hunters being led to deer or other prey items by ravens, who were then hoping to feed off the scraps once the hunter's done. And he wondered aloud if something similar was happening here. "We need to follow that crow," he says. And we do. About 100 yards later, the forest just opens up to a small clearing about 20 feet across. And the first thing I see right at my feet is the severely decomposed hind leg of a bear. It's mostly pale bone, little bits of rancid flesh hanging off. It was just a horror of a thing that shared a striking and eerie resemblance to a skeletal human leg. A bit further on, we find a forearm, a bit further a skull. And based on the tooth wear, this had been a very old brown bear. I noticed our surroundings with a little more clarity, and everything was devastated. It looked like a grenade had gone off. The shrubs were stripped of their leaves, branches were broken, and the soil had been scraped from the forest floor and piled into a mound in the center of the space. I had no idea what I was looking at, but John knew immediately. "This is a bear cache," he says. See, brown bears sometimes hide their kills for future consumption, and they do so by burying the meat under a pile of dirt and debris that they scrape together. And in this case, what had been in that cache was another bear. So we started to piece together the evidence based on what we knew. This old brown bear had died, whether it had been killed by a tiger, another bear, died of some other reason, we don't know. At some point, it had been buried by another brown bear. And at some point, a tiger had wandered along, discovered this cache, and spent several days digging up and consuming various bear bits. And this was why the tiger's radio collar had been giving off these passive signals. It had been lazing about in a bear-induced food coma. So I heard some crows bustling impatiently in the canopy, and I was reminded how we found this place to begin with. Were the crows waiting for us to dig up more bear? And this is why I think this is a story about a crow. So despite all we know about tigers and bears and the technology of VHF collars and radio equipment, it was a bird, it was a crow that helped us figure out what was going on here. And I think there's an important lesson in this, to not rely too much on technology. These innovations, they may be smart and they may be convenient, but they're not always right and they don't have all the answers. So remember to heed the signs that you see in nature and to always follow the crow.
Thank you, John. Thank you all for attending. Special thanks again to our storytellers, our very brave storytellers. This episode will live live on mywcs.org and should be posted there tomorrow. Lastly, if you're now thinking, I have a story too, please email me at ssautner@wcs.org. Let's talk. See you at the next Bison.